So as you ascend up in the world of luxury watches, one aspect that becomes better and better is the aspect of finishing. This is the time and attention to detail spent on the smallest aspects of a watch case, a dial, and also with movements. So in this video, what we're gonna be doing is looking at some of the best finished watches under $5,000. So how this is going to work, we're gonna look at a variety of different categories and look at a collection of watches that are gonna span from $1,000 to $5,000. After watching this video, and you're maybe wondering why we're starting at $1,000 here, we have a whole video looking at some of the best finished watches under $1,000, so I'll link to that in the description down below to watch after this video. We'll have a small subset of independent watches or more micro brand watches at the beginning, because I think some of these watches certainly deserve a nod here and are arguably better than some of the mainstream brands at delivering on this point. Also, what we'll do too, the first category of watches are going to be looking mostly after we go through those independents, looking at case finish and dial finish, and then what we'll do at the end is look at some watches that are very good in the movement category when it comes to that level of finishing, because unlike under $1,000, movement finishing start to become more of a play here compared to under $1,000 where you're dealing with mostly off-the-shelf movements. And just before we begin, this is a watch that would have probably been on this list, but it just came out after recording this video. As an honorable mention and a new watch announcement to start here, Longines just added a well-finished true GMT watch to their lineup, fusing dive watch functionality with their stellar GMT movement with the Hydro Conquest GMT. This line comes with multiple different dial colors and priced under $2,800 on a bracelet. For context, falling below that of the Longines Zulu Time. Now this watch doesn't come with a COSC certification, however, with a class-leading movement for the price, a well-finished case, exceptional water resistance of 300 meters, and a ceramic bezel with a true GMT movement on the inside, this is just another watch to add to your radar. With this initial unveiling, it comes in with a case size of 41 millimeters, and as mentioned, it was just announced, so if you want more details, check it out now on teddybaldassarre.com. Links will be in the description down below. So to kick us off here, we have a brand that has been really making waves as of late. This is Christopher Ward with the 12. So this is their take on the integrated style sports watch, and following up on their very successful Bel Canto. I wanted to include this watch though, because for one, it's less expensive. And then number two, for those, if you're looking at just finishing alone and it's a connection to price, I think for finishing for $1, this watch is finished to a very excellent degree. The Bel Canto is well finished too, but that is a price that's going to be raised as a byproduct of the complication rather than it is the movement finishing and quality that you're getting here. This collection is their take on the integrated steel sports watch type of trend. There's also a titanium version of this piece. Reminds me a lot of the Shopek Antarctique. This is kind of a more contemporary take on an integrated sports watch. So I like the look, 40 millimeters in case size, 44.5 millimeter lugs, but not gonna wear to that lug to lug metric given the integrated style. Nothing new here if you're familiar with these type of watches. 100 meters water resistance, SW200 on the inside, and I think this is another pillar for Christopher Ward as a brand that is definitely rising the ranks and getting a lot of appreciation, and rightfully so. So this next brand is one based out of St. Louis, Missouri of all places, all Swiss-made watches. This is a watch that I have actually covered and done a full in-depth review on. This is the Manta Atlas. So there are different Manta models that you can look at here, but one that I wanted to fixate on is the Atlas, just because of some of the details with the GMT hand, as well as the dial details and just the general case finish. It's very well done. For me, representing a different take on a design style of a GMT and also having some really cool details that we can touch on here. I have a full video on these watches, and I think it's one of the better micro brands or independent brands under $2,000 in terms of just delivering from a finishing standpoint. You look at the case and bracelet, well done across the board. The clasp is well finished, but two details that really stick out to me are going to be those indices, those markers on the dial for the hour markers. Really well finished, the polishing and how they're able to catch the light. Certainly a notable feature of these watches, and because they are more raised from the dial, one of the cool aspects and tie-ins of this piece is the GMT hand. If you look at it from a side angle, you'll recognize that the tip is actually bent up to have enough clearance to clear over those hour markers, which I think is really cool. Next up, we have to look at this brand. This brand is a must for this list. This is Formex with the Reef GMT. You could put any Formex watch on this list, honestly, and it would be absolutely deserving of being on the list. The finishing of these watches becomes less of a surprise when you know about their CEO, Rafael Granito's family are being owners of an organization called Dexel SA. They're a high-end supplier of cases and bracelets and small parts for some of the biggest names in luxury watchmaking. So by taking that know-how and deploying it into a brand like Formex, they've been able to really take off and do some very unique things, including with their Essence line, a whole patented suspension system, on-the-fly adjustment, clasps that are very unique. But the Reef is just across the board an exceptionally finished watch. So the previous watches were more about the case bracelet finish. Next, we're going to look at a watch that excels in the dial finishing category, and that is with Anordain, looking at the Model 1 Plum Fume, because I think this is the best representation of going that extra mile for their dials and showcasing what they do best. So there are many different Anordain models. They are known for their enameling, and I think this is one of the best representations of doing this well at a price range that is a bit more attainable. Now, their prices are certainly going up. They're very backed up in terms of production, but that is all with, I think, good reason. These are not the easiest dials to make. It's a much more difficult process to produce enamel than many other dials out there. You're dealing with these powdered glass layers that are going to be layered on top of each other and then are going to be heated in an oven up to 800 degrees Celsius. They're based in Scotland. I think they do some of the best enamel work under $5,000, certainly on a short list, if not maybe a leader in this category, and have quickly ascended as probably one of the best independents under $5,000. Now we move into mainstream brands, and to look at our first watch here in this category, just over $1,000, we have the Mito Multifort TV Big Day. This is a new release for 2023, taking their 1970s design of their TV shaped cases and infusing some high horology inspiration in the process and creating an end result with a big date function that is pretty compelling and very interesting for the price range. So this is a new release for 2023. And I'm gonna call attention to a few things about this watch. If you're familiar with Mito, you know that their cases and their bracelets are very well done. The only downside I will say from a functional standpoint for the bracelet of this watch, polishing and then the micro adjustment probably being the main point of criticism. Because it has a butterfly style clasp, that is one downside. Usually Mito is very good when it comes to micro adjustment, but that is one area that these are going to have a bit more of an issue. But across the board, very well finished. The faceting of the case sides and the stepping, the crown guard system, also with the dial itself, much more visually interesting than you'll find with other watches that are going this lane of style. But to call attention to one of these, detailed elements that might get lost is what goes on with this date wheel. So there's actually two different discs underneath it, and as that change happens, you'll have both of these discs that will intersect over one another to create this unique visual effect. This is something typically associated with the high watchmaking brands of Glashütte in Germany. So to see this in a watch just over $1,000, I mean, pretty remarkable. So now we're gonna look at a watch from Seiko over $1,000. And I know for some of you, you're like covering your head for cover because this is a weird topic for some, but this is actually not even technically a Seiko, it's a King Seiko. And there was some mixed feelings about this watch when it was first unveiled. This is the SPB 279. When people saw this for the first time, I think they loved the looks, but there was some potential friction when it came to the movement that they decided to utilize for this watch. But for me, I think one thing that was lost in the mix for this, because I do understand some of the criticisms on the movement, but if you were able to handle these watches and not just see it as specs on paper, I think one area that they absolutely knocked it out of the park with is just the finishing of this case, this dial, and just feeling very much like an elevated package. Whether or not the movement is a deal breaker for you, totally understand people bringing that up. I brought it up in my review. But if you look at the details of this watch when it comes to the finishing, absolutely phenomenal. I would argue potentially one of the best finished Seiko cases that I have come across, as well as bracelets. Now, this is based on King Seiko models from the 1960s, and they're really known for these sharply cut mirroring reflections, and you see that on those lugs. They're a bit more prominent here, more bolstered compared to other Seiko models. You also have these faceted hour markers when we can show maybe some up close detail of these finer grain details and the way they reflect. Simply beautiful. And then also the bracelet. I would say it articulates on the wrist, drapes better than any other bracelet that I've managed to handle from Seiko. The hands are cut razor sharp and have that same mirroring reflection that you'll see with other aspects of the case. And also the case back is well finished with that nice classic emblem that you'll affiliate with King Seiko models. So I know for some that finishing department and some of these case details are not why you're maybe looking at a King Seiko, but it is something that I think got lost when trying to inspect these watches for the first time. Moving right along, we have a watch from Longines. This is the update to one of their long-standing model families and a name that they've used for decades. This is the new Longines Conquest 2023. If you're familiar with the previous Conquest models, you probably will characterize them as going a much different direction compared to these because of the large numerals on the dial, and then most probably known was the large crown guard and crown on those watches that allowed 300 meters of water resistance, which is no joke. This totally takes a different approach to delivering on these watches. What Longines is clearly doing here is upping the finishing across the board, making it more of a refined watch and a versatile watch, and positioning it just under $2,000, which I think is probably a good move, because for somebody that's just looking for the best do-it-all watch that could work in any scenario practically with 100 meters of water resistance and these looks, probably more viable than the previous version, and getting, if you look at these side by side, a nice increase to the finishing level and looking much more buttoned up in comparison. So next we have a dive watch that really sets the standard for around $2,000, and even for when you're utilizing their caliber 400s, around $3,000 to $4,000 are right in the mix for a great watch to consider. Here we have the Oris Aquis. The Aquis is the best-selling model family and the contemporary dive watch from Oris. And why I think it's very unique and just kind of setting that standard in many ways is many dive watches in this price arena are more heritage inspired. The Aquis is very much on the nose of being a contemporary dive watch, professional dive watch. And for those out there that want a different approach and want to go more in this direction, I think this is a breath of fresh air. I also think the caliber 400 range for Oris, where these watches start to sit around $3,000, $4,000, are still absolutely fine for the price range. The case is still well done and I think matches up very well, but where it really excels is where you're getting those Solita models and it just becomes a class leading case finish. The integration with the bracelet to the case, well done. The polishing, although is going to be maybe more polishing than what some people might like. Nice ceramic insert on these watches and a dial that is pretty straightforward, but is not gonna have you longing for anything really more. It just delivers on that package. Moving right along, back to a Longines model, we have the Longines Spirit Zulu Time. So we saw the release of these last year. This is honoring a 1925 release from the brand with the original Zulu Time, notably being the first wristwatch with those two different time zones on the watch. Then back in 1908, they had a pocket watch that was doing that. So remarkable history in this category. And I think this watch, both from its history standpoint, its finishing, and its movement on the inside, the dial is well done. You have that metal ring effect that creates some more of a polished lift. Then you have the diamond-shaped cutouts, creating some texture, the clean bezel with the insert containing markings that are well done, the hairline bevel casting along the length of the case, the nice bracelet, though perhaps slightly behind something like Tudor, given the lack of on-the-fly adjustment, but still having many points of micro adjustment, so you will be able to get a good fit here. In many aspects, whether it's finishing, history, delivering on the movement specs, it's one of those watches that just checks off the boxes. Now next up we have the Tudor Black Bay, and I thought it made sense to look at something like the Black Bay 36 or the non-diver Black Bay models because it, with the new updates, feels more in alignment with showing off those elements of finishing. I know some people think that Tudor is more of a utilitarian finish brand in comparison to others. They're not very flashy with their finishing techniques, but very similar to Rolex, it's more of just delivering on the price value. It's not about going over the top when it comes to like all of the details. It's just the details, when they're done, are so done to a degree that are consistent and you know what to expect. And that's part of the charm of the whole Rolex Tudor organization, I think, for so many people. It's not that they have the best finished watches in the world, the movements are the craziest or anything of that sort. It's not about like that level of horology. It's just that they are consistent and they do an amazing job for the price that they ask. So Grand Seiko absolutely needs to be on this list, and I'm gonna have them on this list in two different categories. First here, looking at one element that they do exceptionally, and that is dial finish. Here we're going to be looking at one of their manual powered watches. This is the SBGW 283. This is a spin-off of this very popular 37mm collection of a manual wound dress watch, and delivering with a dial that is truly demonstrating what they do best in this price arena. You have this fine textured dial pattern in this delicate shade of pale blue, the color of the skies above Mount Iwate as summer begins, as Grand Seiko will say, because we have to have that romantic imagery when you're talking about Grand Seiko. And they do it well. I mean, as much as people like to joke about this, I mean, this style is simply beautiful to look at. You see the details. The color here too is a beautiful shade of blue, very understated, it's cool, it's relaxing, and it fuses really well with that texture. Now, next up, we have a watch that I think has a ton of potential and is probably overlooked by many people as a result of the movement on the inside. But in terms of finishing, being unique, and delivering as a nice do-it-all watch, we have the Breitling Chronomat Automatic. This is the 36mm option, so the 3-hand version of the Chronomat. When many people think of the Chronomat, they think of the chronograph versions, they think of the 1980s inspiration of that bullet bracelet style and design. But infusing this to a 3-hand watch, I think is really cool, and I wish Breitling would just keep going down this path, because this is now, I think, delivering a lot of just potential for the brand and being a counterpoint to maybe something like a Rolex or Omega with their Aquaterra, and being their answer to this and also having their own design DNA. There's really nothing else that looks like this. Dial finish is well done, hand set, the markers, everything along with that logo that's applied to the dial. I really like how these watches look. Very reliable movement. I understand some of the criticism though, being in a watch around $5,000, but I would love to see Breitling start to incorporate just more with this design. I think there's more here with this 3-hand, and now is what we're seeing with like the Omega Aquaterras, and Omega not even being on this list because there's really nothing now at retail pricing under $5,000 that's going to showcase some of these movements, these coaxial movements like the 8800s. It's just harder to come by now. I think there's an opportunity here for Breitling to really start to elevate this collection as being kind of that everyday style watch, where many of their watches are more towards that chronograph side of what they're delivering. Now, in a similar fashion to the previous one, I think the only downside of this piece is potentially like the movement on the inside. But if you're familiar with this brand, you know that one area that they excel, and I would argue this is probably the best finished case on this entire list, or really close to being towards the top. This is the Bell & Ross BR05. This is their integrated sports watch take, infusing some different inspirations from a variety of places while still infusing their own DNA into the design and not really pulling from one direct source. 2019 release, now spanning a variety of different models and case styles in terms of steel and gold, and you have stainless steel. I'm a big fan of the way that these watches look, and also in addition to that, I would argue that Bell & Ross, for a design standpoint and then also from a case finishing standpoint, are just as good as any brand. I think one point of criticism for them is just falling behind maybe in some of the movement tech, with many brands now producing their own manufactured calibers, with the likes of like a Tudor, for example, that really made strides in this arena in the past 5 or so years. But the cases, I would put them up against any other brand in this category for price. And I think the BR05 exemplifies this idea to the highest degree. So now for this last section, I want to focus on movements. And unlike the $1,000 and under category, we're dealing with those off-the-shelf movements, as you start to get closer to $5,000, you start to begin to see this point of separation for some brands in the area of movement finishing. Although not getting to the extent as you'll see as you start to even go up higher in price, this is starting to be where you begin to see some brands start to showcase their acumen for this whole focus. To kick us off, I want to look at a brand that I think is arguably the best at this under $5,000, and this is Nomos. We're going to look at the Club Sport Neomatic because it utilizes one of my favorite movements from the brand, and a really good looking one. This is the DUW 3001. These movements have a proprietary escapement. They also are very well finished across the board. I think most people, when they think of Nomos nowadays, they think of their dial designs, their case silhouette, but you could argue that their secret sauce and where they separate when you're talking about a watchmaking standpoint is with their movements. Their movements are beautiful for this price category, and they're also truly in-house movements. Their story started with the Pazoo 7001, utilizing that movement, and then now shifting that into a manual in-house movement, their Nomos Alpha manual caliber, and now have delivered on creating well over a dozen in-house movements to their name now, with their own proprietary escapement system to go along with it. But this movement for myself is probably when you start to get to that next level. You get the swing system escapement, you're getting those waves across the bridges, lovely rotor finish, blued screws, perlage on the base plate. Also, for some of these watches, they fill up the case more than others. So if you get this in like a smaller cased up watch, it really fills it up and gives it this nice view. And then for many of these watches too that are housing this 3001, you'll find this in things like their Ahoys and like their Club Sport Neomatics. In many instances, getting a water resistance rating well over 100 meters and some 200 meters. And even if you look at their Nomos Alpha manual calibers that start around $1,500, $1,600, you'll start to see those in watches. A little bit more if you're trying to actually see that movement on display with the sapphire back. Even around $2,000, you could argue pretty much one of the best finished movements you're going to find for the price category. It's a beautiful thing to look at. So now we cut back to Grand Seiko, and this is in a very similar way that I talked about Nomos and their movement finishing. I think this is an area where a lot of people don't consider Grand Seiko to the degree that they should. They think about their movements, but it's always to the technical side and their innovations. Grand Seiko spring drive, tri-synchro regulator, then you look at something like the 9SA5, their Kodo Tourbillon. It's more about what they were able to achieve from a technical architecture rather than the actual finishing to that architecture itself. Now the 9R65 is a movement that's going to be utilized in a wide selection of Grand Seiko watches from different price ranges, but you can find it in watches under $5,000 retail price. It's going to be a little bit more rare, but it is still going to happen in some instances. It's a very beautiful looking movement. I don't think we give it enough credit because we talk about the technical achievement of the spring drive and it being an anomaly in the world of watchmaking that we forget that this is still a well-finished movement across the board. Just to call an example out, we have the SPGA 469, this beautiful blue texturized dial surface. But we'll show here just some of the details of this 9R65 movement. This is really that flagship model movement for this collection. You have these textured rib waves across the central bridges and on the skeletonized rotor with the fine-grained grooves set within, those cut angles on the bridge edges and tasteful text for the engraving. We've become so fixated on many of these other points of Grand Seiko that something like their movement finish, especially for finding something like this under $5,000, doesn't probably get enough credit that it deserves. So although not finished to the same degree as Nomos and Grand Seiko, I do think you have to give this brand kudos in being one of the few manufacturer caliber producers in this price range and doing it with more up spec compared to your off-the-shelf Etta caliber. This is a brand, Frederic Constant, that now has over 30 manufactured calibers to their name, which is pretty remarkable, and nobody probably knows that unless you're more in the weeds about this brand and know that. This is their classic world timer. This is known as a watch that familiar with being probably one of the best valued world timers on the market because of its price, but then also how easy it is to function as a world timer with one single crown to activate all those different functions. Now, again, they're not to the same level as that of the previous Nomos as well as Grand Seiko, but no question a step up compared to conventional Ettas. You see perlage on its base plate, circular waves on the central bridges, a golden rotor, and a tasteful array of presented jewels and screws for the watch. Sure, a bit more utilitarian in finish, but compared to what you're seeing nowadays with many just off-the-shelf movements, I think you have to give something like this a good shout as one of the few standouts in this price range. And now the final watch on this list, this is a bit more of an oddball pick, and some might argue with me on this, but hopefully after seeing some of the B-roll here, you'll maybe see where I'm coming from. This is the Accutron Space View. This is a watch that now is sitting as kind of that flagship model for Accutron and being a part of their DNA, using electrostatic energy and technology to create this very futuristic looking watch, but also looking back to the past, to the mid 20th century. You have these large electrostatic generators that convert your everyday movement into energy by way of its electrostatic combine motor, which is located at the aperture at 10 o'clock. And it's a pretty cool end result. It's creating accuracy of plus or minus 5 seconds a month. As a note, the spring drive is plus or minus 1 second a day. So in terms of accuracy, much more elite. It has a power save mode. It's a pretty intricate watch, but why I wanted to put it in this video is because I think many people get caught up in the tech and not just looking at how well finished this watch is. But showing some of these detailed macro shots, I hope some of this comes out. You have that green plate that has rounded corners with the applied Accutron tuning fork, but then you have also those bridges sitting above the generators and the combine motor. And I would say the real stars. You have this brushing on the tops and then polishing the angles on the interiors. This is just one of those pieces where you're like, wait, I wasn't expecting this. And also where Bulova was actually the parent company for Accutron for quite some time, they basically separated and now is being seen as its own watchmaking pursuit and really has been given full backing by the Citizen Watch Corporation. And I think you're seeing that with some of the technology on display as well as the finishing in the details. But all right, guys, that is my list here today looking at some of the best finished watches under $5,000. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. Really would appreciate it because that does help out the channel. And don't just say that, so really would appreciate that. Also, if you thought there was a watch that needed to be included on this list that was not included, please leave a comment down below. Definitely check out that under 1,000 best finished watches list that I'll have in the description down below after this one. Also, definitely check out TeddyBaldassarre.com, full authorized dealer of 30 brands, quick and fast fulfillment, dedicated customer support, and a full factory warranty for all the products that we offer. Also, how we were able to support all this content, produce all this content. We don't charge the brands to produce content on this channel. It's all through selling watches on our site. So it allows us to keep doing what we're doing. If you are in the market for a watch, I know that you can buy a watch pretty much anywhere nowadays, but we'd love to have your business. It allows us to keep doing what we're doing, and we love what we do here. But guys, thank you again so much for watching. Be well, and I will see you all very soon.